This meme came across my desk this morning, and by synchronicity, it also is included in the first essay of Jung's Red Book for Our Time, so I thought I would read the accompanying material first. Not the opinion of any individual contemporary will decide the truth and error of what has been discovered, but rather future generations and destiny. There are things that are not yet true today. Perhaps we are not yet permitted to recognize them as true, although they may be true tomorrow. Therefore, every pioneer must take his own path, alone but hopeful, with the open eyes of one who is conscious of its solitude and of the perils of its dim precipices. Our age is seeking a new spring of life. I found one and drank of it, and the water tasted good. That is all that I can and want to say. My intention and my duty to society is fulfilled when I have described, as well as I can, the way that led me to the spring. The reproaches of those who do not follow this way have never troubled me, nor ever will. C.G. Jung, from Collected Papers on Analytical Psychology, pages 443 and 444. Today I'm going to read from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Murray Stein and Thomas Arzt, Volume 1. This is a 3-volume series. The first 2 volumes have been published, and they include 36 essays by Jungian analysts discussing the Red Book from different points of view. The very first of these essays is by one of the editors, Dr. Thomas Arzt. Dr. Arzt is not a clinical psychologist, he's a physicist, but he took on this monumental task and is editing these 50 essays. The 3rd volume is expected out later this year. A year ago, I received my copy of the 1st volume, published by Chiron Publications, and I was really profoundly moved by the first essay in this Volume 1, which is by Thomas Arzt himself. So I'm going to read that today. I have read it in parts over about a year ago or 9 months ago, but today I'm going to read it end to end. And it begins with a part of the quote that I just read to you. Our age is seeking a new spring of life. I found one and drank of it, and the water tasted good. C.G. Jung. A spectre haunts our world today. Its name is Angst. Small wonder, as former German Secretary of State Frank-Walter Steinmeier recently remarked, the world is out of joint. At the same time, German diplomats such as Wolfgang Ischinger have noted that the disintegration of international security structures has accelerated and that decision makers in politics and business are overrun by unexpected events on a daily basis. Diagnosticians of our times, like German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, see the world plunging forward. The World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report 2017 identifies a hazardous planetary risk landscape that does not invite for much cheerfulness and serenity. Our present age, which we may call postmodernity, is characterized by an overwhelming amount of fluidity and volatility on a global scale, as well as on the level of everyday lives of individuals. Cynical contemporaries even speak of a racing standstill. Although nothing remains the same, nothing substantial does in fact change, even if we cannot yet see the direction in which this unbridled fast train engine called globalization will take us. Today's world is obviously undergoing historic transformations that are probably unique in size and scale. Pourvu que cela dure. If only this will work out well in the long run, as Napoleon's mother remarked while witnessing the coronation of her son. In fact, there have always been turbulent thrusts, cracks, faults, and societal feverish states. Contemporary historians usually attribute these two exclusively to technological change and innovation. For example, if we consider the decade prior to the year 1914, as Philip Blum's work, The Vertigo Years, Change and Culture in the West, 1900 to 1914, impressively shows, we find that the first 14 years of the 20th century saw rapid socio-economic developments that put the individuals, as well as many European societies, into a highly agitated state. The spirit of this time, as C.G. Jung referred to it in his Red Book, then led Europeans, as though sleepwalking, to exhausting trench warfare and technological mobilization, giving rise to geopolitical realignments. What is disconcerting is Blum's observation, quote, "Then as now, rapid changes in technology, globalization, communication technologies, and changes in the social fabric dominated conversations and newspaper articles. Then as now, cultures of mass consumption stamped their mark on the time. Then as now, the feeling of living in an accelerating world, of speeding into the unknown, was overwhelming," unquote. The tremors of World War I consequently led to World War II. In our time, total mobilization has reached the planetary level. Just one spiral turn higher. Once more, we are disoriented in an epoch of Angst. And now, 100 years after the age of anxiety, we find ourselves again restless in the age of burnout. Artists and sensitive contemporaries who lived between the years 1880 and 1914, such as the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, intuited the seismographic shift that was about to come. Bewildered by societal developments and generational world weariness, trapped in the prison of reason and yearning for an absent meaning, the best minds look for new ways out of the spiritual malaise of their time. Dadaist Hugo Ball described the collective condition of his generation as follows, quote, "The world and society in 1913 looked like this. Life is completely confined and shackled. A kind of economic fatalism prevails. Each individual, whether he insists on it or not, is assigned a special role, and with it his interests and his character. The church is regarded as a redemption factory of little importance, literature as a safety valve. The most burning question day and night is there anywhere a force that is strong enough to put an end to this state of affairs? And if not, how can one escape it?" Unquote. God is dead, as Nietzsche announced, and the iron cage of modernity was, in the meantime, having turned into an omnipresent digitalized gestell rigidly established. Contemporaries sensed the severe implications of the erosion of the Christian myth, not to be at home in one's own time anymore. Then, as now, the collective situation forced the search for transcendence and meaning in order to withstand the undertow of the postmodern chaos that has undoubtedly revealed a nihilistic signature. The Swiss psychologist C.G. Jung undertook perhaps the most challenging deep dive to seek answers to the questions posed by the epoch. Alarmed by visions and dreams which reflected the tensions of his era and presaged the coming world war, Jung daringly searched for his soul in an experiment to learn his personal myth. After the descent, Jung not only formulated his own myth, but was also able to suggest the framework for a new collective myth. As will be illustrated later, Jung's Red Book, Liber Novus, is both a highly intimate testimonial and a reference to the framework of this new collective myth. Even though the term postmodernity is difficult to define and contains a high degree of ambiguity due to its notorious lack of conceptual clarity, attempts at diagnostic analysis have shown several general characteristics, such as a deconstructionism, radical plurality, arbitrariness, liquidity, fragmentation, decanonization, acceleration, muddling through, increase in complexity, ambiguity, and slippery slopes. In a few sentences, German writer Hans Magnus Enzensberger masterfully portrays our contemporary postmodern condition in which the increase of entropy can even be witnessed right in our own backyards. Quote, Lower Bavarian market towns, rural villages in the Eifel, small towns in Holstein are populating themselves with figures that nobody would have considered imaginable just 30 years ago. Golf-playing butchers, wives imported from Thailand, undercover intelligence officers in allotment gardens, Turkish mullahs, female pharmacists in Nicaragua committees, Mercedes-Benz driving vagabonds, anti-authoritarians with organic gardens, gun-collecting tax officers, farmers breeding peacocks, militant lesbians, Tamil ice cream vendors, classical philologists trading commodities futures, mercenaries on home leave, extremist animal rights activists, cocaine dealers with tanning salons, dominatrices with customers from top management, computer freaks commuting between Californian databases and Hessian wildlife reserve parks, carpenters delivering doors made of gold to Saudi Arabia, art forgers, Karl May scholars, bodyguards, jazz experts, palliative care physicians, and porn producers, the loners and village idiots, weirdos, and misfits all have been replaced by the mediocre deviant who does not even stick out anymore among the millions of his ilk. Unquote. In one important aspect, and this is the essential point with regard to Jung's Red Book, the diagnoses of our time appear to converge. There is, according to French philosopher and sociologist Jean-François Lyotard, himself a disappointed Marxist by his own admission, no major, meaningful, and integrative meta-narrative anymore. No grand narrative that is able to impart an all-encompassing conception of humankind's role in the world. For any grand narrative, such as is offered, for example, by the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Bible, the Odyssey, the Enlightenment, the belief in science, or Marxism, the following postmodern analysis applies. Quote, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives. This incredulity is undoubtedly a product of progress in the sciences, but that progress in turn presupposes it. To the obsolescence of the meta-narrative apparatus of legitimation corresponds most notably the crisis of metaphysical philosophy and of the university institution which in the past relied on it. The narrative function is losing its functors, its great hero, its great dangers, its great voyages, its great goal. It is being dispersed in clouds of narrative language. Narrative, but also denotative, prescriptive, descriptive, and so on. Conveyed within each cloud are pragmatic valencies, specific to its kind. Each of us lives at the intersection of many of these." Unquote. From a spiritual point of view, the horizon of meaning offered by a divine order, the great order of being, is seemingly lost, while from the perspective of the postmodern subject, the world as well as life itself is not readable, understandable, or shapeable anymore. Whereas prior epics had a meaningful grand narrative, here Dante's Divine Comedy, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, and Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra come to mind. The modern or postmodern man is left without a timely, central, and vivid myth. In Edward Edinger's estimation, this condition of spiritual and metaphysical homelessness, a state of being perhaps best captured by Nietzsche's Last Man or Martin Heidegger's They, has only deepened in later times. Quote, "It is evident to thoughtful people that Western society no longer has a viable, functioning myth. Indeed, all major world cultures are approaching, to a greater or lesser extent, the state of mythlessness. The breakdown of a central myth is like the shattering of a vessel containing a precious essence. Meaning is lost." Referring back to Jung's work, Edinger continues, "As Jung's discovery of his own mythlessness paralleled the mythless condition of modern society, so Jung's discovery of his own individual myth will prove to be the first emergence of our new collective myth." Referring back to Jung's work, Edinger continues, "As Jung's discovery of his own mythlessness paralleled the mythless condition of modern society, so Jung's discovery of his own individual myth will prove to be the first emergence of our new collective myth." Edinger's statement is only understandable if one puts aside the discourse of academic sociologists, cultural theorists, and professional philosophers, opening up to the sphere of individual core experience, Kernerfahrung, in the sense of Karlfried Graf Durkheim, or Jung's experience of the self. One approaches the psychological, religious, spiritual, and metaphysical realms of life that are generally thought to be off limits by today's postmodern academic establishment. Nothing causes greater tedium and disregards the central questions of our time more than the ignorance and prevailing bustle witnessed within the self-referential and detail-obsessed chairs of our university institutions. In all likelihood, nothing revelatory will come from their discourse. It might be this near universal bypassing of the central questions of our present age that is globally driving an increasing interest in Jung. The 21st century could be Jung's century, a century in which a postmodern state of mind and the demise of the secular conception of the human stimulates the intense search for sustainable alternatives to an epoch dominated by positivism, materialism, reductionism, and atheism. After all, in a spell of pneumophobia, Modernity's dethronement of déraison led to an oppression of all phenomena of the spirit or the sacred. Subsequently, the spirit, as well as the anima mundi, according to Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli, has disappeared into the unconscious. Jung described this process in The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man as follows, quote, "Whenever there exists some external form, be it an ideal or a ritual, by which all the yearnings and hopes of the soul are adequately expressed, as for instance in a living religion, then we may say that the psyche is outside and that there is no psychic problem, just as there is no unconscious in our sense of the word. The consonance with this truth, the discovery of psychology, falls entirely within the last decades, although long before that man was introspective and intelligent enough to recognize the facts that are the subject matter of psychology. So also a spiritual need has produced in our time the discovery of psychology. The psychic facts still existed earlier, of course, but they did not attract attention. No one noticed them. People got along without them. But today, we can no longer get along unless we pay attention to the psyche. Du se retire. Nonetheless, one has to follow God, according to the view of German writer Ernst Junger. Hence, the engagement with the unconscious becomes a vital necessity, not only for the individual, but for the social collective, since it has become a matter of survival. Ironically, the historic moment of the proclamation of the iron cage by sociologist and philosopher Max Weber coincided with the beginning of depth psychology, perhaps an unexpected cunning of reason. From the perspective of Jung's understanding of the evolution of human consciousness, the project of maternity could only lead to the darkening of the world. As Heidegger said, quote, "For all ages before us have believed in gods in some form or other. Only an unparalleled impoverishment of symbolism could enable us to rediscover the gods as psychic factors, that is, as archetypes of the unconscious. Since the stars have fallen from heaven and our highest symbols have paled, a secret life holds sway in the unconscious. That is why we have a psychology today and why we speak of the unconscious. All of this would be quite superfluous in an age or culture that possessed symbols. Symbols are spirit from above, and under those conditions the spirit is above too. Therefore, it would be a foolish and senseless undertaking for such people to wish to experience or investigate an unconscious that contains nothing but the silent, undisturbed sway of nature. Our unconscious, on the other hand, hides living water, spirit that has become nature, and that is why it is disturbed. Heaven has become for us the cosmic space of the physicists, and the divine empyrean, a fair memory of things that once were. But the heart glows, and a secret unrest gnaws at the roots of our being." Unquote. The spirit is waiting in the collective unconscious for recognition, for integration into the collective unconscious of our postmodern times. Today, the spirit is knocking at our door, or as Junger put it, the primordial essence is alive. Many pathologies of our age emerge from the lack of having an alchemical vessel to integrate these archetypal spiritual energies into the socio-cultural context. If the individual or society denies these energies the chance for expression, they will turn to confusion, destruction, and violence. Mercurius duplex. It was alchemy that found the adequate expression for this, good with the good and bad with the bad. For the time being, though, it remains a mystery how the oversaturated, overaged, and overregulated societies of the West, run by disoriented and unimaginative guardians of the status quo in politics, media, and business, should approach this monumental challenge. We are devoid of any vision for the future. Quote, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity," lamented William Butler Yeats during Jung's day. Meanwhile, much would be gained if the planetary turbulences of postmodernity could be interpreted as a pregnant phase of initiation, as a rite de passage. In this sense, future generations would be inclined retrospectively to understand our postmodern era as a phase of negredo, as a time of collective disorientation and confusion, with its attitude toward the world manically oscillating between a Baroque lust for life and an apocalyptic foreboding of death. From Jung's perspective, it is important, though, to face the insecurity and abyss of postmodern life and to accept our spiritual nakedness as well as the obvious dissolution of traditional belief systems. An openness to the psyche so that its intimidations can be consciously realized is crucial too. Further, we have to learn how to deal with existential insecurity, uncertainty, and ambivalence, because at the center of anxiety, something may want to speak to us. If we are in a state of darkness, it is divine darkness. If we feel ourselves to be stuck in a state of void, it is a divine void. In a similar point of view, German philosopher Leopold Ziegler considers the state of Western forgetting of being a gestalt of a divine being in absconditas. Within the metaphysical loneliness of modern consciousness, Jung detects a divine providence, or rather an occasion for a renewed experience of spirituality, especially as the living spirit attempts to resurrect from the ruins of the Christian edifice of beliefs. In this sense, the deconstruction frenzy of the 20th century would be understandable, as Richard Tarnas has pointed out. Quote, "The 20th century's massive and radical breakdown of so many structures, cultural, philosophical, scientific, religious, moral, artistic, social, economic, political, atomic, ecological, all this suggests a necessary deconstruction prior to a new birth," unquote. If Tarnas has it right, coming generations, hopefully, might perhaps look back one day also on a phase of rubedo, the emergence of a new post-Christian spirituality. How to continue now? We are currently living in a historic moment in which all aspects of human existence have to be reconceived and radically put to the test with respect to the secret life of the living spirit. Support may be offered by Jung's psychological law of energy conservation, stating that if anything of importance is devalued in our conscious life and perishes, so runs the law, there arises a compensation in the unconscious. What Jung is saying is that if the archetypal world of spirit gets ignored by a purely materialistic worldview for too long, the former will be subsequently activated with a proportionally high energetic value in the collective unconscious. Even for the simple-minded, this should be plausible insofar as the religious impulses of the soul, anima naturaliter religiosa, cannot merely vanish into thin air. Rather, it will be forced to change locations due to the overdose of modern rationality. Quote, "It may be possible to suppress them, but it cannot alter their nature. And what is suppressed comes up again in another place in altered form, this time loaded with a resentment that makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy." Unquote. Since the archetypal world cannot be suppressed without substantial consequences, and since contemporary society and culture are not able to tackle the actual problems, let alone draw up feasible solutions, it is the individual that ultimately has to face this conflict. Sensible, sensitive, even deranged contemporaries once again have to restore the spiritual anchorage that has been undercut by postmodern categories of interpretation, leading to the ensuing psychological crisis. The challenge today, therefore, is on the one hand not to discard our Christian tradition and heritage, and on the other hand to face up to the state of negredo into which we have descended. In Jung's view, we are standing at the beginning of a new psychological culture and era. One still, however, without collective guiding images, symbols, rituals, and myths. Entering uncharted territory within this new culture goes hand in hand with the following prerequisite developments already underway. New integration efforts concerning the inclusion of evil within the understanding of wholeness, as well as the unsightly and banal, integration of the feminine and nature as significant dimensions repressed and neglected by Christianity. Reinterpretation of religious scriptures as poetic and symbolic rather than as purely historical and literal. Reinterpretation of the figure of Christ as a symbolic expression of the inner dynamics of the soul. At this point, it seems clear that under postmodern conditions, only one path forward remains passable. If we have interpreted the signs of our time correctly, the metamorphosis of the gods will require the individual's utmost commitment to an ongoing process for which Jung proposed the term individuation. The narrative for this is contained in the Red Book, and with it begins Jung's new myth showing, quote, the way of what is to come, unquote. Thank you for joining me for this reading today. I'm reading from Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Mary Stein and Thomas Arzt. This is volume 1 of the 3-volume series. My soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak. I call you. Are you there? On November 12, 1913, Jung began his inner work on what would eventually become his Red Book. This dramatic passage occurs in the chapter titled Refinding the Soul. In a preliminary remark, Jung had noted that he had been able to attain honor, power, wealth, knowledge, and every human happiness, while distress in his inner and the outer worlds had overcome him with horror. Given his break with Sigmund Freud and the resulting state of questioning his previous understanding of the psyche, Jung's distress becomes understandable. Weighing heavily also was a series of remarkable dreams, visions, and waking fantasies that left him bewildered to the point of suspecting an impending psychosis. Slowly, however, Jung began to realize that, for instance, his waking fantasies in October 1913, in which Europe was flood-ravaged, described in precognitive form events that were about to happen not uniquely to him, but to Europe collectively with the outbreak of World War I. Within this personal, highly disturbed state of mind, and within the catastrophic world situation, something else that had already bothered Jung after putting the finishing touches on symbols of transformation again became painfully evident to him. namely that a man who thinks he can live without myth or outside it is an exception. He is like one uprooted, having no true link either with the past or with the ancestral life which continues within him, or yet with contemporary human society. Then, stating his own personal dilemma, he continues, quote, I was driven to ask myself in all seriousness, what is the myth you are living? I found no answer to this question and had to admit that I was not living with a myth or even in a myth, but rather in an uncertain cloud of theoretical possibilities, which I was beginning to regard with increasing distrust. I did not know that I was living a myth, and if I had known it, I would not have known what sort of myth was ordering my life without my knowledge. So in the most natural way, I took it upon myself to get to know my myth, and I regarded this as the task of tasks. For so I told myself, how could I, when treating my patients, make due allowance for the personal factor, for my own personal equation, which is yet so necessary for a knowledge of the other person, if I was unconscious of it? I simply had to know what unconscious or preconscious myth was forming me, from what rhizome I sprang, unquote. And so, in November 1913, during an experiment of self-discovery, my most difficult experiment, Jung embarked on a search for his own myth. This search would lead him to a new spring of life, about which he would later write to Victor White, quote, I wanted the proof of a living spirit, and I got it. Don't ask me at what price, unquote. Initially, Jung wrote down his fantasies and active imaginations in the so-called black books, which are regarded as a personal protocol of his self-experiment. From there, they found their way into a red leather bound folio volume for which he revised the material while also enhancing it with commentary and carefully drawn and meticulously arranged pictures. In Sono Shamdasani's summary view, the Red Book presents, quote, a series of active imaginations together with Jung's attempt to understand their significance. This work of understanding encompasses a number of interlinked threads. An attempt to understand himself and to integrate and develop the various components of his personality. An attempt to understand the structure of the human personality in general. An attempt to understand the relation of the individual to present-day society and to the community of the dead. An attempt to understand the psychological and historical effects of Christianity, and an attempt to grasp the future religious development of the West. Jung discusses many other themes in the work, including the nature of self-knowledge, the nature of the soul, the relations of thinking and feeling and the psychological types, the relation of inner and outer masculinity and femininity, the uniting of opposites, solitude, the value of scholarship and learning, the status of science, the significance of symbols and how they are understood, the meaning of the war, madness, divine madness, and psychiatry, how the imitation of Christ is to be understood today, the death of God, the historical significance of Nietzsche, and the relation of magic and reason, unquote. Wolfgang Gegerich argues that the Red Book is to be read as Jung's answer to Nietzsche. Like many of his generation, Jung tried to confront the implications of modernity head-on. Here, by the way, one may be reminded of Heidegger's and Junger's disputation over the line, in which both, with respect to the question of nihilism, navigate in Nietzsche's wake. But Jung did not see his solution represented in Nietzsche's Übermensch. It was rather in the formulation of a new spirituality. The title of this solution is The Process of Individuation. Quote, "The overall theme of the book is how Jung regains his soul and overcomes the contemporary malaise of spiritual alienation. This is ultimately achieved through enabling the rebirth of a new image of God in his soul and developing a new worldview on the form of a psychological and theological cosmology. Liber Novus presents the prototype of Jung's conception of the individuation process, which he held to be the universal form of individual psychological development. Liber Novus itself can be understood on one hand as depicting Jung's individuation process. Liber Novus itself can be understood on one hand as Liber Novus itself can be understood on one hand as depicting Jung's individuation process, and on the other hand as his elaboration of this concept as a general psychological schema." Unquote. The loners and village idiots, weirdos and misfits, all have been replaced by the mediocre deviant, who does not even stick out anymore among the millions of his ilk. Unquote. Wow. I guess that sort of sums it up. Going on. Referring back to Jung's work, Edinger continues, "As Jung's discovery of his own mythlessness paralleled the mythless condition of modern society, so Jung's discovery of his own individual myth will prove to be the first emergence of our new collective myth." Okay, so, as I said, okay. Nothing causes greater tedium and disregards the central questions of our time more than the ignorance and prevailing bustle witnessed within the self-referential and detail-obsessed chairs of our university institutions. In all likelihood, nothing revelatory will come from their discourse. I'm sorry. Thomas is really telling it like it is here. Now, I'll just say as an aside, the terms negredo and rubedo come from alchemical symbolism, which is an entirely different subject, but you can look them up on Wikipedia, I presume, or look up the phases of alchemy, and you then will understand negredo and rubedo. And these are also terms that are used among Jungian analysts to relate to individual analysis. However, in this case, Dr. Arzt is using them with respect to society as a whole. Let me, if you're not familiar with it, I happen to have the 2009 published version of Liber Novus, which is a huge volume. I can't get far enough away from the camera to show you, but in the first couple of hundred pages is written in German calligraphy in Jung's own hand. And like a European manuscript, there are many illuminations, and there are also many actual paintings that are quite remarkable, like this painting as an example. I just opened at random. So this is the Red Book in the folio version. It's available now from Amazon for something like $150, and it has in the back, everything is in English. Now, if you don't have $150 to buy the folio version, which for me was a gift from my wife for Christmas, you can, for about $25, get the reader's edition, which has only the words. And then if you look up Jung's Red Book images, you can see most of the images from the Red Book.